A second popular misconception about philosophy is that philosophy is useless. So this raises the question of whether philosophy is useful or useless. It's often assumed that it is. It's often believed that philosophers simply split hairs and debate endlessly about meaningless problems. These charges, to be honest, do have some merit. Philosophers, like all academics, often get lost in the ivory towers and become needlessly isolated from the world, debating about things as whether blue is green or green is blue, and whether chairs exist, etc. And looking at some of the philosophical debates over the centuries, and especially recently, it's easy to look at it and say this is all just useless BS. So the charge is certainly worth considering. So how do we look at it actually in some detail and rationally, without simply just saying, oh, it's useless, and just leave it at that? Well, as we saw in the previous misconception, philosophy is not just opinion, and we also looked at argument basics. So if someone claims philosophy is useless, they just can't say it and leave it at that. They've got to back it up. Now, often this misconception rests on how people define the term useful. As you might imagine, people who have this misconception often define usefulness in a very narrow and very concrete way, often in terms of directly making money, or baking bread, building bridges, or killing people. So one option would be to argue for a different definition of usefulness, and talk about it in terms of the value of knowledge for its own sake, etc. There's also the option of simply sticking with that very narrow and concrete definition to fight the battle of usefulness and uselessness on the terms of the person making the charge. Now, even under that very narrow and very concrete definition, that philosophy's got to make money, bake bread, build bridges, kill people, the argument can still be made that it's useful. Now again, we should certainly consider that there are broader definitions of useful that seem quite plausible, that there is value in things other than simply directly making money, baking bread, building bridges, and killing people, etc. Now, under this very limited definition of useful, many things would not be useful or valuable either. Much of what we enjoy in life, things like art and so on. But again, let's just stick with the tough case, where we've got to show the person who says that it's got to be, very narrow and concretely defined. It's got to be useful for directly making money, building bridges, baking bread, killing people, etc. That concrete stuff. So to make this case, we can look at the contributions of philosophy and philosophers. One is, as we'll see in the future, science. Science originated in philosophy. Many philosophers were also scientists, such as the very first philosopher and scientist that we know about, our good dead friend Thales. Then, of course, our good dead friends Rene Descartes, Bacon, not Kevin Bacon, another Bacon, and Sir Isaac Newton, the inventor of the Fig Newton. No, that's not true. Sorry, he's the Isaac Newton guy, the gravity guy. Now, science, as I mentioned, arose from philosophy. What typically happens is that when a branch of philosophy becomes well developed and starts making clear progress, it splits off from philosophy to become a science. And one legacy or relic of this is that if a person has a PhD, they have a doctorate in philosophy. And if you have a PhD in chemistry, you have a doctorate of philosophy in chemistry, etc. And so in the early days of philosophy, what is typically called natural philosophy, it's what today we would call science. So one of the big contributions of philosophy in the past was the development of science. Secondly, logic and mathematics. Mathematics and logic were developed by philosophers, and logic is still clearly part of philosophy, although mathematics has largely gone off on its own. It's grown up and moved out of the house. Famous philosophers who did math and logic include our good dead friend Pythagoras, And Pythagoras also believed in reincarnation and that numbers are really real. Not in the sense that you can see them like drawn on paper, but they're real entities, as real as you and I, and Matt Damon, one supposes. Plato, of course, and Aristotle, big into logic. Aristotle has really laid down the foundations of what we now consider to be logic, developing categorical logic. A good dead friend, Descartes, of course, you might be familiar with him for the Cartesian coordinates. He's a geometry guy. And Leibniz, of course, developing binary mathematics, the idea that all numbers can be reduced down to zeros and ones. Our good dead friend, Blaise Pascal, a name that sounds like he should be a action hero or porn star, or possibly both. And we'll actually look at these guys, Descartes, Plato, Leibniz, and Pascal. Now, why is logic and math important? Well, science, technology and engineering depend entirely on math and logic. So, a fair question might be, what has logic and math done for me lately? Well, what you could say is, hey, philosophers, you're grabbing math, but math is its own thing. Okay, sure, these dead guys, and gals developed math, and they were philosophers too, but now math its own thing. Get your hands off math. So, what about logic, which still belongs to philosophy? Well, logic is the basis of computers, ranging from PCs to car chips to smartphones to handle gaming systems, like the Switch, as well as, of course, PlayStations and Xboxes, and all the web pages, essentially crudely put, run on this logic stuff. So if there had not been philosophers and philosophy to develop this logic, there'd be none of this stuff. So in terms of what philosophy has brought us, you could say the entire information age is literally running philosophy. Now again, you might say, hey, that's not fair, philosophy, it's all these computer engineers and so forth who did this. You don't get any credit for it. But that would be unfair. Philosophers developed the logic, and that is a contribution of philosophy. Critical thinking was developed by philosophers, and it still is under philosophy. And that's, even if you say, hey, you don't get logic, which would be bizarre because we do get logic, we also have critical thinking, developed by philosophers, taught by philosophers, and part of philosophy. So those are all important, valuable contributions made by philosophers and also philosophy. Now, what else has philosophy done? Suppose you want to say, yeah, the math people, they get math, logic belongs to logicians, yeah, we'll give you critical thinking for now until it splits off into its own little field, or own big field. So what about society and civilization and so on? Well, philosophers laid the foundation for rights, reform, and revolution. Our good dead friend Aristotle developed political science. Hobbes developed one of the main justifications for the modern state. Our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, who we'll look at. Our good dead friend John Locke developed the notions of God-given human rights, the notion of natural rights. And so the Declaration of Independence talks about, endowed by their creator, etc., etc. This is straight out of philosophy. Adam Smith, a philosopher, laid the theoretical foundations for capitalism. Henry David Thoreau, a philosopher, created the concept of civil disobedience, later adopted by Gandhi, and of course, returning to America where it originated with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then, although these two philosophers are often used to argue against philosophy and say how horrible philosophy is, we have to, of course, acknowledge Karl Marx, the least funny of the Marx brothers, and Friedrich Engels, who funded him. They developed the theory of Marxism, which, whether you hate it or embrace it and look forward to the proletariat revolution, has been a huge factor in shaping the world. So you could say that our entire notion of, in a way, civilization, rights, laws, reform, revolution, economic theories, all arose out of philosophy. And those seem to be pretty useful, or at least pretty important. Now, of course, you could also make the argument that some do, well, now economics belongs to the economist, politics belongs to political scientists, but still these notions of, of rights and so forth still belong in philosophy. Now, we also, of course, have ethics. Philosophers develop the notion of formal ethics, and ethical reasoning is philosophical. Unless someone is just utterly rejecting the value of ethics, which some people do, it would be reasonable to accept that ethics is a very important and useful thing in making important moral decisions in everyday life, and that's still a critical part of philosophy. And so if we want to reject the value of philosophy, we'd have to throw away ethics and rights and all those notions, which some people are willing to do. Now, a fair question to ask, of course, is, okay, yeah, I'll grant that philosophy's done all this stuff in the past, and all these, philosophers did things that are useful today, but what has philosophy done lately? And what can it do for me now? What's in it for me? So what are some benefits of philosophy? Well, to be utterly practical and cynical, completing this course gets you 3 credit hours towards, and also a Gen Ed Humanities requirement, so useful there. What about outside of academics? Well, the study and practice of philosophy can develop essential skills, like critical thinking and logical thought. And if you take the class in critical thinking, you'll see just how useful this is. It's great for making good decisions, distinguishing between what is likely to be untrue and what is likely to be true. And good decision making requires distinguishing between claims that are not credible and claims that are credible. Also, logic, super useful. From this, you also get useful problem-solving skills, and of course, not unique to philosophy, but you do develop writing skills. So one of the main things is reasoning skills, and reasoning well is essentially useful, and as I often tell people, it can save your life, quite literally. The study and practice of philosophy also broadens the mind. It enables a person to develop a better appreciation and understanding of their own views. It enables a person to better understand and appreciate the views of others, even if you disagree with them. It does encourage intellectual tolerance, which is to say, a willingness to consider the views of others. You may still think them to be wrong, and have good reasons to believe it, and you may even think that they're terrible, but at least you'll have good reasons as to why they're terrible. It also encourages the development of intellectual imagination, which is a very useful skill. Philosophy does, of course, come with some side effects. Since it's all about having to argue for everything and prove things and question things, it can result in confusion, doubt, and distress. These can be natural side effects of thinking and questioning previously held beliefs. But I want to assure you that my role as a philosopher teaching philosophy academically is not to destroy your beliefs, not to change your mind about your core values. The idea is to develop your skills in thinking and reasoning, and also, of course, to provide you with information about these philosophy folks and their philosophical views. My goal is not to preach or indoctrinate, but simply to give you skills and knowledge that can be useful. So I'm not trying to prove that any of your views are wrong, or right for that matter. But you'll develop tools that you can use to defend your beliefs. If a person's beliefs are true, they can be defended with philosophical means. So that takes us to the end of the popular misconceptions about philosophy, and hopefully we've seen that philosophy has some use, if only in knocking out 3 credits and taking care of that Gen Ed Humanities requirement.